everything seems to be in Martha's Vineyard of the time is about either God or Satan.
Yeah.
It's a religion-soaked society, I think.
It is, yeah.
What was the contact like between the Europeans and the native people?
So when I first saw, I first came across this story when we moved to the vineyard, and I wanted to know more about my new Native American neighbors, because I'd never had Native American neighbors before. I wanted to know more about the culture and history of the tribe. And the tribe prepared this fantastic map of the island showing all the sites of significance in their storytelling and all the place names in Wampanoag. And on it was this notation saying that it was the birthplace of the first Native American graduate and that he'd graduated in 1665. And the date just took a hold of my imagination because it's 100 years before the white history of Australia even starts, and already there's Harvard. You know, that was a surprise to me. And then I think I wanted to know why there are English on Martha's Vineyard that early, to have identified him as an apt scholar and to have set this process in motion. And I found that a handful of English settlers had come in 1641. And I thought, well, why would you? It's inconvenient enough living there now. And it turns out that they came to get out from under the thumb of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who had become theocratic and repressive and quite brutal with dissidents. You know, some of their penalties were having your ear sliced off and, you know, banishing people, and they sounded really Taliban-esque. And it turns out that this little group had decided that they wanted to do their own thing, and the only way you could do that was to get off the mainland. And so one of them bought the patent to the island from the English lord who purported to own it, but he also quite intelligently sent his son to negotiate with the Wampanoag, because there were 20 English families and 3,000 Wampanoag. And so he knew that he needed to buy the land from somebody, and he found that one of the Songkhem's or leaders thought it was a good idea. And so for the first year, there wasn't much interaction. And then one Wampanoag, who was a bit of an outcast among his own people, started to hang around the English village, and he became the first Christian convert.
Was it the idea of the English to convert the so-called savages? Was that part of their...
Actually, they use a different word, which is interesting to me, salvages.
Salvages, yes.
Those needing to be salvaged, yeah, saved. It was the idea of one of them. The others, I think, couldn't have given a rat's.
Yes, right.
But the son, Thomas Mayhew Jr., was, by all accounts, a very decent man. The consequences of what he did, you know, turned out to be not so good, but I think he did it with a good heart, and he really wanted to convert everybody to Christianity. And so he started a mission to the Indians, and part of it was education. And he started the first school on the island for the children of the Wampanoag, before there was one for the children of the English. And the Wampanoag were very keen on this idea of the book. That really grabbed them, and that's one of the things I think that's very interesting about Native American interaction in general, is that they were early adopters of ideas that they thought had merit for them to use. The same way the Plains Indians, we always imagine them on horseback, but there were no horses until the Spanish brought them. And so for the Wampanoag, it was the book, and it was because they were well aware that big epidemics had already swept through the mainland and had carried off elders before their knowledge could be passed on. And so they wanted this skill, and they got it. They became literate very, very early.
There's a scene early in the novel where Bethia gives Caleb a book. It's the first book he's ever seen or held or whatever. Tell me about him. Is he exceptional? What?
I think he was an exceptional intellect. To do what he did, because we can tell from his dates that he was raised in his own language and culture, unlike his classmate Joel, who, being the son of the Christian convert, would have been raised in very close proximity with the English settlement and by and large was essentially an English cultural product. Caleb was not. So Caleb was the one who made the crossing from his own belief system and language to first master English and then Latin and Greek before he even started at Harvard. And then the course of study at Harvard was very rigorous liberal arts classical education that involved learning the poetry of ancient Greece and the rhetoric of Rome and natural science and geometry and astronomy. And in the end, your final exam was that you had to sit in the hall for 6 days, and anyone who had a master's degree could come and interrogate you. And that was called sitting solstices. And if any of them found that you weren't a good debater, then you wouldn't get your degree. So I think he was remarkable.
Did he learn English from Bethaya, or did he have...
Well, there wasn't a Bethaya as far as we know. She's entirely invented. I believe he probably learned English in Thomas Mayhew's school.
Because you said in Harvard they spoke Greek, or Latin rather.
Latin. So he went to prep school on the mainland for a long time.
Harvard was essentially a religious...
I thought that.
Was it a seminary, wasn't it?
No,
almost?
I thought that, but it wasn't actually. It was as close as they could make it to Trinity College, Cambridge, because that's where most of the founders had been educated. And they didn't actually study theology per se. They studied the classics. They were literary scholars.
Did you mentioned your Native American neighbors on the island, on Martha's Vineyard, did they help you at all with?
Oh yeah.
How, in what way? How
in many ways, trying to understand. Not so much Caleb, because sadly there's very little known about him. I wish there was more, and maybe that more will come to light. We've got one letter from his own hand, and one other little shard of information has become available since the book was published. But they helped me by understanding what life was like and how did you make a canoe and how did you catch fish and how does the language tell you, what can it tell you about the thinking and the cosmology and all that. So those were the areas where I got a lot of help.
Did it give you a different feeling or a more clearly defined feeling about the European contact and what happened to Native Americans and later and all of that? Yeah,
because what happened on the island was the road not taken elsewhere. It never came to bloodshed on the island. And when you're in the period of the novel, one of the tasks as a novelist was to clear my head of everything that I knew was coming, because my characters don't know. And a different future is still possible for them. And I think the whole Indian College at Harvard was part of that different path. And of course we know that it all turned to war in 1675, and after that, any idea of the two people sharing the land in any way, nobody was interested in it. Well, the English weren't interested in it, and then it was just bloodshed and dispossession from then on. So yeah, it's a very wistful feeling about how just another, turn of the clock in a different direction. And even, I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but if Caleb had lived, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say even his life might have tilted the direction that things went in, because I have established now that he was very close to Thomas Danforth, who was, some of you might know him from The Crucible as the judge at the Salem witch trials. Arthur Miller actually casts him unfavorably in the play, but he was actually the voice of reason in that madness. And he was a very influential magistrate in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and a deputy governor at one point. And Caleb was working very closely with him, and it seems like Caleb was destined not to be a minister, which had been the intention, but to be a legal scholar and a man of affairs. And maybe, had he lived, he would have been a negotiator with Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoag, and maybe war wouldn't have happened then.
It could have all turned out differently.
It could, it might, so this is all speculation, but you can't help feeling a great sense of regret. And then, you know, for the next 300 years, Harvard forgot this history of its founding, and the founding document says that the college is for the education of the English and Indian youth of this country. Well, tell that to the 300 years of waspy white male super privilege that ensued. And they'd even forgotten where the college had been located. So they've been doing an archaeological dig.
In Cambridge?
Yeah, since 2006 they started looking for the Indian College, and last summer they found the foundations, and then they had to close the dig for winter. But when they reopen it, they'll be able to go right down to the 17th century level, and maybe we'll find out more about these remarkable young scholars.
I'm curious to know how you come to a particular subject and particular characters. You told somebody once that you like to write the kinds of novels that you like to read. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm a big fan of Mary Renaud, who writes about the classical world. She's an English author. And I think the first historical fiction that ever grabbed me was her Alexander trilogy, particularly The Persian Boy. And I like it very much because it has a first-person narrator, and it takes you to a completely different mindset. You're never in any doubt that he sees the world through Persian eyes and of that time, but it's a wonderful sort of oblique look at what Alexander was like and what he was up to. And even though the time and place and the way of thinking is very different, she gives her characters an emotional familiarity. And I think she must have believed what I believe, which is the human heart is unchanging. And the things that really shape us are the strong emotions that we share.
But what is the kind of the generating spark that turns you onto something? For example, how did you come to think of writing Little Women or looking at it from the viewpoint of the father? Yeah,
it didn't really start with Little Women. March, it started as sort of self-defense to save my marriage. My husband, Tony Horwitz, is a major Civil War nerd, and I hadn't realized that I'd married a Civil War obsessive, because the first 14 years of our marriage were spent overseas as foreign correspondents, and it wasn't until we decided to spend a bit of time close to his family in Virginia that I realized what I got myself into.
He wrote a book on the replayers, or recreate.
He wrote, it's about the Civil War and how it's still being fought in many ways, politically and actually by these kind of obsessed reenactors who are very close to his heart. But he would drag me to all this Civil War-related stuff, and you know, there's a saying that the Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, and it became apparent that he intended to take me to every single and I had to find something to do, you know, so I started to get really interested in that idea of what happens to idealists when they go to war, believing in a good cause, and they go for good reasons, and then they end up doing terrible things. And that happens a lot in war, but I think in the Civil War, particularly the abolitionists, and then they find themselves in this army that's just as racist as the Southerners. And what happens when you see your side is capable of great atrocity? So I'm thinking about that, and then, you know, suddenly this light bulb goes on that I've actually read a Civil War novel, and that it was Little Women. When I read it as an Australian kid, I didn't even realize it was an American novel, because all our fiction came from England at that time. So I thought the March Girls were just another bunch of foreigners, and it hadn't actually occurred to me that the backdrop was actually the Civil War, and that the girls are alone because the father, at, you know, an age when it's not sensible to do so, has gone off to be a minister to the Union troops because he's such an ardent abolitionist. And I thought, that's my guy. That's my idealist at war. He was a beautiful found object. And I had the architecture of Louisa May's story, and we're not told a lot about him. We know that he goes, and we know that he almost dies of illness, and Mommy has to go to Washington to his bedside. And we know that he comes home, and that's about it.
Did your husband say, "Oh God, not you too"? Or?
No, he said, "Thank God now I can bring all my Civil War books back onto the main bookshelf."
In People of the Book, you take a document, the Sarajevo Haggadah, pardon me, and you trace it through different generations, different centuries, different people, and so on, and it becomes a very enmeshed, almost a travel log of people. How did you get onto something like that? Did you hear about it when you were in the Balkans, or did you?
Yes. Yeah, and I always think about Ernest Hemingway, who said an idea for a novel can be something you're lucky enough to overhear, or the wreck of your whole damn life.
Yes, right.
And it was something I overheard in a bar in Sarajevo. I thought Hemingway would really approve of that. I was there to cover what the UN was and was not doing during the siege of the city. And the talk, the gossip among the journalists, was all about this missing treasure of the Bosnian National Museum, the Sarajevo Haggadah created in medieval Spain. A great rarity because it was beautifully illuminated at a time when it was thought that Jews eschewed figurative art because of the commandment against making graven images. And yet here's this book with lots of beautiful pictures. And it was missing and nobody knew where it was. And when I found out, and the journalists had all kinds of crazy ideas that Mossad had come and taken it, or that the Bosnian Muslim government had sold it on the black market to buy weapons. And when the true story was disclosed, that a Muslim librarian had risked his life and gone in under shelling to save this Jewish book, I was off to the races.
But you must have had to learn everything, or a lot, about bookbinding, and there's one, I'm not describing it very clearly, but there's one part where a blood stain is found on one of the pages, and you trace the whole history of that blood stain. And so you must have known about forensics and bookbinding. And
it was great. I didn't know anything about book conservation, and what a fantastic job that is. I mean, that was a happy coincidence, because it turned out that the UN was funding conservation work on the Sarajevo Haggadah so that they could put it back on display, because it had become this symbol of the multi-ethnic ideal of the city. And it was considered a real morale booster to get it back out there. So the UN hired a conservator, and I badgered everybody I'd ever worked with at the UN as a correspondent, and they were really sorry they knew me after a while, to go to Sarajevo and observe the work. And so I sat there while she took the book apart and painstakingly did all the repair work. And what grabbed me was that if she found something in the binding, like a crumb or a little quill pairing, she would take it and put it in an envelope and send it away for chemical analysis. Because what's found in a book can tell you a wealth of information about the book's travels through time. And so I immediately had my narrative structure, that my bookbinder would find things and go back in time. So the bloodstain was completely fictional. There's no bloodstain on the Sarajevo Haggadah. There is a wine stain. And so I was emailing with this conservation scientist at the Harvard Museums about how you would investigate a wine stain. And he said, I can tell you all this, but you should really see it, so bring some wine. And he said, I've got, some 600-year-old parchment scraps lying around. And so we'll splash the wine on it and I'll show you what I would do. And so that's what I did. And then my plot point, I wanted it to actually have blood mixed in. So I said, well, would you be able to tell the difference? Would you be able to tell? And he said, well, let's see, because you use spectrometry, but we haven't got any blood. So I said, give me that scalpel. Now we've got blood. So that's the only time I really bled for my work.
Do anything for the sake of your art, really?